The night sky over suburban Gwinnett County, Georgia, was the kind that held a quiet promise, warm, still, the roads illuminated by soft halos of street lamps and the distant glow of city lights. In the summer of 2022, this was the world that 16-year-old Susana Morales knew as she walked home from a friend's house in the serene sprawl of Norcross. It was the sort of evening that, in hindsight, feels ordinary, unremarkable, yet it would become the last night of her life. The events that followed would ripple outward, shaking communities, exposing fractures in trust, and leaving unanswered questions about protection, power, and vulnerability in a world that should have kept her safe. Susana had grown up in a neighborhood like many others, neighbors with familiar faces, routine drives to school, afternoons spent with friends. She was a teenager at the threshold of possibility, navigating school, friendships, and the normal rhythms of youth. That late July evening, she left the Sterling Glen apartments, stepping onto the quiet pavement with an expectation of returning home. No one imagined that within hours, the space between the apartment and her front door would become a corridor through which fate would change irrevocably. When Susana didn't come home that night, an unsettling silence began to grow. At first, her absence was chalked up to useful unpredictability, a late call, a text that never arrived, a minor oversight. But as hours turned to days, her family's concern deepened into dread. They reached out to police, to friends, to anyone who might have seen her. Each unanswered call etched uncertainty into their voices, their questions lingering in the stale air of living rooms that once buzzed with laughter. Meanwhile, law enforcement's early response to her disappearance did not carry the urgency that one would expect when a young life vanishes into the night. Initial reports treated her absence as that of a runaway, a classification that would weigh heavily on her family and critics alike, who believed that those first moments, the earliest search efforts, were crucial and yet sorely diminished. The delay in treating this as a missing persons case would become one of many strains on the search for truth. For 7 months, Susana's family held vigil in a limbo that feels timeless to those who live it. Days began blending into nights, eyes scanning highways and wooded areas, hearts pounding at the sight of every unfamiliar face, every distant siren. Hope, a fragile thread, was knotted with fear. They organized searches, distributed flyers, and scoured the woods off Highway 316 near Decula, an area of dense trees and shadowed underbrush that whispered with the possibilities of what might have happened. Then, in the early weeks of 2023, that thread would snap. A passerby in those same woods came upon a grim scene, human remains, and nearby the service weapon of a local police officer who had reported it stolen around the time of Susana's disappearance. The convergence of these discoveries sent shockwaves through the investigation, not merely because of the evidence itself, but because the person who would soon be at the center of the case was an individual sworn to protect. Miles Bryant, a 23-year-old former officer with the Doraville Police Department, lived in the same apartment complex as the friend Susana had visited the night she vanished. As details began to emerge, a horrifying picture took shape. An officer, trained to serve and safeguard, became the prime suspect in her kidnapping and murder. Investigators pieced together digital footprints, phone pings placing Bryant near the location where Susana's remains were found, and the weapon, a department-issued firearm, found within the wooded burial site. In court, prosecutors presented these findings not as abstract evidence, but as a narrative of betrayal and violence. The charges that would follow included kidnapping, felony murder, malice murder, and false reporting, painting a portrait of a young girl seized in trust's shadow and left in the wilderness of deceit. In a development that further complicated the public's understanding of the crime, an indictment added a count of attempted rape, a stark reminder of the layers of trauma involved in Susana's final hours. The trial, when it began, unearthed more than forensic data and phone records. It exposed community anguish, raising voices among Hispanics and other local residents who felt that their missing children were not accorded equal urgency by authorities. Protesters gathered outside police precincts, not merely in grief for Susana, but in a broader call for systemic change, a demand that every missing child be met with vigilant pursuit, regardless of background. Inside the courtroom, the gravity of the case weighed heavily on all who entered. Witnesses described patterns of behavior that hinted at pre-existing issues, allegations of stalking, harassment, and inappropriate conduct attributed to Bryant by former acquaintances. One accuser recounted encounters that were unsettling enough to spur formal complaints before Susana's disappearance. These testimonies complicated the narrative. Were there signs before that were overlooked? Did the institution meant to protect inadvertently misjudge the danger posed by one of its own? When the jury returned its verdict in June 2024, the weight of evidence against Bryant culminated in a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Convictions on kidnapping, felony murder, malice murder, and related charges stood as an official reckoning of responsibility. For Susana's family, the verdict brought a measure of justice, though justice is not balm, and grief does not lift with legal pronouncements. Their statements from the bench echoed with enduring sorrow. Nothing can restore the life that was lost. Nothing can fill the void of a daughter's absence. Yet even in resolution, questions remain about the moments leading up to Susana's disappearance, about the institutional responses that followed, and about the broader forces of bias and oversight that families fear may have cost precious time. In the quiet spaces where memory lingers, the story of one girl becomes a mirror reflecting deeper fractures in societal trust and communal safety. In the days following the verdict, as cameras packed away and reporters moved on to the next breaking story, Gwinnett County returned to a quieter rhythm. But beneath that surface calm, the case of Susana Morales did not recede. It settled into conversations held behind closed doors, into the pauses that lingered when parents watched their children walk a little farther ahead than usual, into the collective memory of a community that had been forced to confront a deeply unsettling truth. The danger had not come from the shadows, but from someone entrusted with authority. To understand how Susana's final journey unfolded, investigators retraced the geography of her last known movements with painstaking care. The Sterling Glen Apartments sat just off a web of local roads, modest, familiar paths that teenagers and families navigated daily without fear. Surveillance footage from nearby buildings captured fragments of that evening: the glow of headlights passing through parking lots, the stillness of sidewalks after dusk, the sense that nothing out of the ordinary was taking place. And yet, somewhere within that ordinary frame, Susana disappeared. phone records became one of the investigation's most revealing tools. Data placed Miles Bryant's mobile device in close proximity to Susana's route home at critical moments. Cell tower pings showed his movement not as random, but as purposeful, traveling from the apartment complex toward the wooded area near Highway 316, an isolated stretch of land miles away from where Susana was last seen. The timeline suggested a sequence that prosecutors would later argue could not be coincidence, a digital trail that quietly contradicted Bryant's initial statements to police. Those statements, given early in the investigation, would later unravel under scrutiny. Bryant had reported his service weapons stolen, framing himself as a victim of circumstance rather than a participant in a crime. At the time, the report raised little alarm. Firearms go missing, paperwork is filed, procedures are followed. But when that same weapon was recovered near Susana's remains, the narrative shifted dramatically. What once appeared to be an unfortunate loss now stood as a tangible link between a police officer and a murdered teenager. The location where Susana's body was found added another layer to the complexity of the case. The woods near Decula were not remote wilderness, but they were secluded enough to offer privacy, a place known more to locals than to passers-by. Investigators noted signs suggesting her body had been deliberately concealed, not discarded in haste. This detail mattered. It spoke to intent, to forethought, to a mind calculating how to avoid detection rather than acting in blind panic. The landscape itself became a silent witness, holding evidence in its soil while months passed above it. As the trial unfolded, the courtroom became a space where facts and human emotion collided. Jurors listened as forensic experts described the condition of Susana's remains with clinical precision, careful not to dramatize what was already devastating. Digital analysts explained how data points form patterns, how movement becomes meaning when viewed in sequence. Each testimony added another strand to a case that was steadily tightening, even as the defense sought to introduce doubt, alternative explanations, hypothetical scenarios that suggested coincidence where prosecutors saw convergence. One of the most disturbing aspects of the case emerged through testimony from women who had encountered Bryant before Susana's disappearance. Their accounts described interactions that felt invasive, unsettling, marked by an abuse of perceived authority. None of these incidents alone constituted proof of murder, but together they painted a psychological portrait that jurors could not easily ignore. Patterns of behavior, prosecutors argued, often precede escalation. Warnings exist, not always as sirens, but as quiet signals that go unheeded. For Susana's family, sitting through these testimonies was a test of endurance. Each detail pulled them back into the months of uncertainty, into the unanswered questions that haunted their days and nights. They had spent half a year living between hope and despair, imagining scenarios where Susana might still be alive, held somewhere, waiting. The discovery of her remains had ended that uncertainty, but replaced it with a different kind of pain, one rooted in finality. Outside the courthouse, the case took on broader meaning. Advocacy groups pointed to Susana's initial classification as a runaway as emblematic of systemic failures, particularly affecting Hispanic families. They argued that assumptions made in the early hours of a disappearance can shape outcomes, influencing how quickly resources are mobilized and how seriously leads are pursued. Law enforcement agencies defended their procedures, but the criticism lingered, fueled by a sense that time, the most critical factor in missing persons cases, had been lost. Even after sentencing, some questions resisted resolution. What precisely prompted the encounter between Susana and Bryant that night? Was it opportunistic, or had he noticed her before? Did anyone see something and dismiss it as ordinary? A car slowing down, a brief exchange, a moment that did not register as danger until it was far too late. These unanswered details remain suspended in the space between evidence and imagination, inaccessible now to investigators and family alike. The case of Susana Morales does not end neatly, despite the life sentence handed down in court. Justice, in its legal sense, was served, but justice does not rewind time or rewrite endings. What remains is a story that continues to echo, a reminder that safety is fragile, that authority can be misused, and that vigilance often begins in the quiet moments we are taught to overlook. In the years to come, Susana's name will likely surface again in discussions about police oversight, about missing persons protocols, about the importance of believing families when they say something is wrong. Her life, though cut short, has become part of a larger narrative, one that asks uncomfortable questions about trust and accountability. And somewhere along the roads she once walked, under the same Georgia sky that watched her disappear, the silence lingers, heavy with what was lost, and with the knowledge that some answers once buried can never be fully unearthed.